Hello and welcome to the Plumes of Oz, where we look at the birds in the wild of Australia. The cockatiel is a parrot-type bird or a cetaciform. The taxonomic classification of this bird historically has been very interesting. Classifying it as a parrot or a cockatoo has always been difficult. It has a crest, so immediately one would think, it's more like a cockatoo. Yet it has a long, narrow tail, more like a parrot. But the underside of the tail has banding, well, in the female and the juvenile, much like a female Calyptorhynchus black cockatoo. It has a yellow cheek patch. Once again, the yellow-tailed black cockatoo has a yellow cheek patch, and the sulphur-crested cockatoo also has a pale yellow cheek patch. And the bones of the skull of a cockatiel more resemble that of a cockatoo than a parrot. You may think I'm suggesting that this bird should be classified as a cockatoo. Not for one moment. When you look at a cockatoo and you look at the cockatiel, you will realise that these birds are totally morphologically different. And the good thing is, DNA suggests that they are different than both cockatoos and parrots. So they are in their own genus, Nymphicus, from the Latin meaning small or baby of a spirit. However, they are still in the family Cacatuidae. Cockatiels are flock birds. Most parrots only go in small flocks, whereas cockatoos go in large flocks. It is not unusual in the dry areas of Australia to see flocks over 100, and this is another similarity of the cockatiel to the cockatoo. A real difference between a cockatiel and a cockatoo is that when the cockatiel turns in flight, the white shoulder just shines in the sun. No cockatoos have white shoulders. The fastest flying cetaciform in Australia is the swift parrot, and this bird certainly lives up to its name as it flies from Tasmania over to the mainland. The cockatiel is not far behind. Once driving at 70 kilometres an hour, I looked out the window and the cockatiels had no trouble keeping up with me. As mentioned, the classification of the cockatiel has been very confusing over the years, both in the changes to the genus and species. A Scottish physician by the name of Robert Kerr is first described as giving the cockatiel its first binomial name of Psittacus novaholandae. I suspect the bird that he identified was found in the museum as he was doing an English translation of Carl Linnaeus's Systematic Nature. Interesting, during Cook's voyage, a crested parakeet was described. This is 4 years earlier than Kerr's original description. But personally, I believe that it's unlikely to have been a cockatiel, for I have never seen them venture out over the sea, but we do not know the exact coordinates of Captain Cook's sighting. Back to the genus name. The term Nymphicus was introduced by Vogel, an ornithologist, replacing the name Psittacus in 1832, and it was popularised when John Gould published his Birds of Australia 10 years later. But there were still further changes to come in the genus name. Leptolophus was perhaps the most common. This is Greek, meaning a delicate crest. Today the genera name has reverted back to Nymphicus in honour of Gould's contribution to ornithology. Look at this beautiful flock of cockatiels. They show classical flock behaviour, coming as a group onto the ground, searching for seed. Cockatiels are ground feeders. I've never seen them eating lerps or chewing on blossom, only taking dry seed off the ground and green seed off the plants, occasionally chewing on a green leaf. As I tried to get closer to these birds to find out exactly what they were feeding on, I noticed that there were other parrot birds there as well. Not so much parrots, but cockatoos, and as you can see, there are some galahs, and flying about and landing in close proximity were budgerigars as well. Unfortunately, suddenly, I was too close. Now notice what the cockatiel does when it takes off from feeding. It lands on the open sticks in a tree. In contrast to this, the long-tailed parrots will fly into the leaf canopy and conceal themselves. Look at this cockatiel, sitting out in the open on a stick. When they are in the canopy, as shown here like this, they are usually in a roosting mode. This is similar behaviour to the cockatoos. Cockatiels have a fairly wide distribution in Australia. They prefer drier areas, so aren't found on the east coast, Cape York and the southwest of Western Australia. Kerr's name Nova Hollandicus, used first to describe the cockatiel, is interesting, for Nova Hollande was the Dutch term used to describe Western Australia, and I strongly suspect that the bird that was identified by Kerr was labelled as coming from Western Australia, but this is just pure speculation. Cockatiels prefer the dry grassland areas, hence their distribution. It is thought that the numbers of cockatiels are increasing, possibly from the more ready availability of water from bores sunk into the artesian basin. For nestlings to survive, they have to be fed. Dry seed is hard to regurgitate, so water is essential. So flocks of 100 birds or more are not uncommon in the dry grasslands of Australia. Cockatiels, like all other Australian cetaceans, breed in hollows of trees. And so as these birds fly around, they are constantly exploring tree hollows. The male bird determines the suitability, then the female will enter the nest, and once this happens, it's nearly a foregone conclusion that this will be a nesting site. Here, a simple exploration. The male looks in, and that's it. It's a large vertical log. The opening is too open. Rain will come in. It's not suitable. The female doesn't even bother about entering. The male flies off to another site. The male has 2 visits, but the female just sits patiently, letting him do the exploration. But the end story was nothing eventuated, despite 2 visits by the male. She didn't enter. An adult pair with 2 fledglings just out of the nest. The young birds do what is called head bobbing, begging for food. The male and the female both feed the young by regurgitation. Like many other cetaceans, they like to have the nest close to water to help in the regurgitation process with moisture content. There are several local names for the cockatiel, Wireo and Quarion. These names reflect the sound that the cockatiel makes in its chatter. But also, Wiro, which I believe is probably Wireo, is an indigenous name given to the cockatiel by the indigenous people in Western Australia. Cockatiels exhibit sexual dimorphism. The juvenile is shown here with the pinstriping down the front and negligible chest barring, and the very soft colours on the cheek patch with minimal vibrancy and more pale grey than dark grey is typical of the juvenile. It is not until the first molt that the male features become more intense, with the colouring of the yellow on the face patch and the orange on the ear patch. Small crests also indicate juvenile birds. The juvenile cockatiel can often be separated from the female, for the barring on the undertail is all in tones of grey, whereas the mature female cockatiel has yellow interlaced with the grey on the barring of the tail, and also the barring will often extend up over the chest, again in grey and yellow. The mature male cockatiel has no barring on the tail at all. In the cetaciforms, or the parrot group of birds, there is a disease called beak and feather disease. This affects only the cetaceans, occasionally a few doves. The cockatiel is resistant to the circovirus causing beak and feather disease, yet all other cetaciforms are susceptible. And the cockatiel is an important model for investigation of immune-related viral diseases. For beak and feather disease attacks the immune system. What has been found is that the oligodeoxynucleotides present in the DNA are more scattered and more prevalent within the cockatiel, and these short-chain nucleotides are immune stimulants, stimulating B lymphocyte activity also activating the T-cell lymphocytes. More interesting is that the cockatiel can be seropositive, as shown with PCR and hemagglutination serology. So the circovirus can affect cockatiels, but they don't get any clinical symptoms of beak and feather disease. So understanding further about the cockatiel's immune system may well help our understanding of the viral diseases that cause immune suppression, like HIV. Here out in western New South Wales is a typical floodplain, and this is where the cockatiels thrive. What amazes me is how they can survive in this environment. Previous to when I filmed this video, there was an extensive drought extending for 6 years. Now, in 2021, there is plenty of seed, and these birds have no trouble surviving. But what amazes me is when they are feeding, they more frequently than not don't land amongst the grass areas. Instead, they land in a patch of burr, prickles, saltbush, maybe a few daisies. Most of this I would regard as non-edible food. But watching them feed, they spend more time in these prickly shrubs than in the grass areas. When I walk through the bush like this, my shoes just get covered in seed, and I suspect this is what they are after. On behalf of Plumes of Oz, thank you for watching this video. If you like to see Australian birds in the wild, hit the subscribe button to get notification of our next release of Australian birds in the wild.